My guest today is Bas Korsten. He's the Global Chief Creative Officer at Wunderman Thompson, an award-winning global advertising agency. Bas has helped make Wunderman Thompson one of the most recognizable and accomplished advertising agencies in the world, delivering the double Grand Prix-winning campaign, the Next Rembrandt. To date, Bas has won 42 Cannes Lions, 11 D&AD Pencils, and many other international awards. In 2016, Bas was awarded a spot in Ad Age's Creative 50, a list of the 50 most creative people in the world, alongside recognizable names such as Tom Ford, Beyonce, Prince, and David Bowie. Bas is the real deal. Expect to learn why Bas made a meatball of mammoth meat. No, seriously, he made a meatball of mammoth tissue. Whether Bas believes AI will replace human creativity, how to enter the alpha flow state, why we may ditch data centers in favor for DNA storage, and much more. But first, you may be watching but not subscribed, and that makes me very sad. Click the red subscribe button below if you're watching on YouTube, or hit the plus follow button on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to not miss the next show. I thank you. But now, ladies and gentlemen, Bas Korsten. What does a mammoth meatball taste like?
I couldn't tell you because that was kind of the only issue with this project was that, and also the reason for being to a certain degree, is that you can't eat it in most countries in the world because it's forbidden. And in Singapore, the law has passed, and you can buy and eat cultured meat or lab-grown meat, as they also refer to it. But in most countries in the world, the legislation hasn't caught up with the technology yet. So I think Australia and America are close to opening up, and hopefully this project has helped in more people knowing about cultured meat as an important alternative to the regular meat industry. So hopefully things will start speeding up now.
So maybe just for a little context, so people don't think I'm just off my rocker asking you about mammoth meatballs, do you want to give a little context and explain what this most recent project that you've been working on is?
Sure. So the project is called the Mammoth Meatball, and it's exactly what it says, which is a big meatball, 15 centimeters in diameter. And it's made out of mammoth meat, which is basically what we did together with Vow, a cultured meat company in Australia, is we looked at the available information about mammoths, and there is actually quite a bit to be found on the internet as far as genetic information. And we used that and looked at the gaps, so what was missing in that information. And then we completed the DNA with African elephant DNA. So we took African elephant DNA bits and inserted them into the mammoth DNA to get to a full DNA strand, and inserted the full genome into carrier cells, grew 20 billion of them, and then we had a big mammoth meatball.
A great big 15 centimeter mammoth meatball. I do want to ask you more about the science and technology and how that kind of is a symbiotic relationship with advertising, but we'll get there in a bit.
Yeah.
In preparation for this conversation, I was doing some reading, doing some research, and I read in the creative review a quote from you, and it said, "I was instantly drawn to the idea of zebra steak or Galapagos turtle burger or giraffe pork chop, just as a creative mind." And I found that was very interesting, just to kind of illuminate how you think about these kind of projects and where your mind goes as a creative. What were you hoping to achieve with this project? What kind of message were you hoping to convey? And do you feel like you completed that?
Yeah, so the reason why I mentioned those is that the initial reason for this project was to to shine a spotlight on cultured meat and on the possibilities of that alternative to real meat, or regular meat, as you, however you want to call it. The problem with that regular meat industry is that we have 8 billion people on the planet now, which will be 10 billion soon. And we're not eating less meat, we're actually consuming more meat as a species. So we other I mean, if we make two planets, then we probably can solve for it. If we don't take two planets, which we don't have, then we need to seriously start thinking about eating and producing our food differently. And cultured meat is a valid alternative in that in that alternative thinking. And the issue that I saw when I first started working on this was the Netherlands has been quite a front runner in the cultured meat space. It's just that the companies that are doing that, like Mosa Meat and Meatable, are focusing on the existing big three, which is pork, beef, and chicken. And they want to, and to be honest, I did go to the idea with them. I did go to them with this idea, but it was too far out for them. They said, we just want to create the alternative to the top three meats out there. And what I thought was interesting was the best you can get to in that thinking is, well, that almost tastes like chicken, or that almost tastes like beef, because everyone knows what tastes, or what chicken or beef tastes like. So then I ran into Vow, and they had a different philosophy, and they said, well, if you don't have to kill the animal, why can't we go for more exotic species? Because these three are easy to domesticate, and that's why we're eating them. But maybe there are other species that are much more tasty or nutritious than these three. And couldn't we? Hold on, my Siri starts acting out. And couldn't we? And that's where the Galapagos turtle burger came from, the zebra steak. Couldn't we look at more exotic species? And I think that's also the reason why they were attracted to this idea about cultured meat from mammoths, because they were looking into those unique species anyway. They hadn't thought yet about extinct species, but that was the idea that we brought in. So I hope that answers your question.
I feel like that's a very Bas Korsten thing to do, is just take one concept and just level it up to the next, a more outrageous level. One thing that I was thinking about this morning, actually, when I was having some breakfast and a coffee, it seems like Vow might be taking a route, and perhaps not, but I thought that this was a very funny idea. Vow might be taking the idea of going for a more premium market and then working their way down, almost like Tesla did with their early cars. They started out at very luxury, high-end products, and now they're moving products that are more accessible for people. And that kind of made me draw a correlation between a Galapagos turtle burger and a Tesla Model S, which I thought was just really, really funny. But this is not your first big stunt. In fact, back in 2016, you had a project called the Next Rembrandt, where you tackled generative AI really before it was a thing. So essentially what you did is you partnered up with data scientists, multiple stakeholders and partners, to analyze Rembrandt paintings, basically come up with all of the data points that you could, figure out what is the most reproducible picture that you could come up with. And then you guys actually created it from a digital object to a physical print with height mapping and everything. So for the unaware listener at the time, I mean, now it might seem like this is something that's a little more accessible, I think, because it is with the tech increase. For the unaware listener at the time, why was this such a monumental project, and why did it draw so much attention?
So I think 2016 and around that time was very much man versus machine. So we just had lost the world Go champion, Go, the Japanese game, had just lost from a computer. I think the world chess champion had just lost from a computer. and creativity was the next frontier, and basically a lot of people were wondering, well, there are some things that are innately human, probably computers can't go there, right? Or AI can't go there. And I think just the next Rembrandt, and what came out was something that opened people's eyes to, hold on, maybe they will come into creativity as a domain as well. And I think that's why it got a lot of traction. Um, so to your point, I mean, today I can just go to DALI 2 or Midjourney and say, hey, do me a Rembrandt. But basically, at that time, we just trained an AI to think like Rembrandt and to think about, okay, how did Rembrandt paint right eyes, and then paint a new right eye out of that, not as an average, but as a projection from what would his next right eye look like, and then did the same for his left eye, his nose, his mouth, and created what could have been a Mr. Potato Head figure, but it actually came out as, and that was, I think, the most interesting thing, something that looked like a person that had a soul. Because if you look into the man's eyes, which it was a man, then it just feels like there's life behind those eyes, and that's super interesting. So yeah, I think what uh, that's a project that we did for ING Bank, because they were sponsoring Dutch arts and culture and had been for 10 years, but they wanted to do something more innovative. And um, there was a late Rembrandt exhibition, I remember clearly, around that time. And I went like late Rembrandt exhibition. So that would be great. But couldn't we use that information to see what would have happened if he hadn't died and had been able to paint one other picture or one other painting? What would have been like? And at the same time, there was a National Geographic issue coming out, and they'd basically recreated Jesus's face out of pieces of skull that they found in Israel. And I thought the idea of using old material and existing things and try to extrapolate that into something new, I thought was an interesting technology. So it was just a few things coming together around that time. And yes, same as with the Mammoth Meatball. Those ideas have been around for long, and they travel, and you try to make them a reality, but you can't predict the moment when they come out, because you don't know how developed technology is, and how far you can go and how quickly you can go. But I think it's interesting to see that somehow they find their way into the world at the right time to get the right amount of traction.
That's an interesting note. How important do you think it is to have these concepts, these projects, these ideas that really push the envelope in order to push the technology forward as a whole? I haven't done any research to see if there's any claims that the Next Rembrandt influenced Midjourney or DALI 2 or any of these products, but it seems like shining a spotlight on what's possible with new technologies is a way of inspiring others to then push forth and take it down from something that takes 18 months to develop, like the Next Rembrandt, into something that takes 30 seconds to generate the next image.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I also don't know how that works. I did think in 7 years' time, will we be looking back at the Mammoth Meatball, and while we construct our own meal from frog DNA combined with some chicken DNA and a little mammoth to create a new meat brand that we can just 3D print in our own house. And I mean, it's hard to predict where it's going, but I think it's going really fast, and how that's also not why these ideas come about. I think the reason for them is to make people think about the more fundamental questions. Like with the Next Rembrandt, it was like, okay, how do we feel ethically about computers and art? Art is something that really comes from a human expression, and oftentimes it comes from a place of grief or sadness or joy, and is that recreatable? Um, and if so, do we want it? And with Mammoth Meat, similarly. I mean, one quote that I like, and it was from Professor Wolvertang, who was the bioengineering professor who helped with this. He said, "Nature is no longer the limitation; our imagination is the limitation." Which, of course, sounds great, but at the same time, if morality isn't keeping up with technology, then who's going to put on the guardrails? And I think generative AI is now is the next frontier when it comes to that issue. Is like, okay, are we going too fast? Should we? I mean, do we can we see the end of it already? And how do we keep it in check? So I think making people think about those things is what I like to do, and then it just means that you need to be at the forefront of technology, and you need to think about uh, where things are going, and then find a brand that you can do a unique expression for.
Lots of interesting threads there that I would love to pull on, but in order to stay focused here, one thing that you mentioned about combining different sequences of genomes and printing off your own unique meats at home, let's say, that made me think of one day there may be a marketplace where people have come up with different strains or hybrids of genomes, and that creates different kinds of meats, and they can then sell those recipes online or something like that. It's
Yeah.
just a wild thought that I feel like people don't quite think about all the time. And as we've been talking about generative AI, this is rapidly changing the way that we work and we think and we create. As you mentioned, is it possible to recreate that human emotion and creativity, that joy, that anger, anguish, things that generally create good art or great art? And even there's been a few cases now of art competitions where people have won with generative AI. So the Colorado State Fair's Digital Fine Arts Competition, Jason Allen took home the prize, where people were working in Photoshop or whatever to create these images, and he created this something Odyssey, which is really just a mind-blowing picture. When I saw it, I could hardly believe that was generated by a computer. It's insane. And even more recently, there's Boris Eldegson. Boris, forgive me for the pronunciation, which and he ended up winning the Sony World Photography Award with generative AI. And it was a bit of a mic drop moment because he won the award and then he said, "I can't accept this. I created this with a tool or with an AI tool." So do you feel like generative AI is a tool to be used, much like a camera has been used to displace painting, which is a large argument that people have? Or is there something lost by using generative AI to create the seeds of what will end up being this flower that turns out to be this creative piece or this creative art? Is there something lost, or is it a tool to just help us?
Well, I think that's the whole discussion. I think if you think about my field of expertise, advertising, there's going to be assets, as in executions, that are going to be created automatically. So there won't be a human in sight. There will be human control, but there won't be a human anywhere near the creation of it or the execution of it. And then there will always be big ideas that I feel that are somehow. I mean, creativity. If you look at it, creativity. I think Steve Jobs explained it like this: it's taking two existing notions and combining them into a new relevant one. And for somebody who came up with the sport foot golf, I can relate to that. I can relate to that definition. But I mean, Mammoth Meatball is also nothing else than combining genetic rescue with cultured meat. Or the next Rembrandt is 400-year-old art with AI. So that definition is very true. Um, the question is that automatable? And I think the people winning the awards, that wasn't AI coming up with it. That was people coming up with it and using AI to execute on it. So I I keep hoping that you will feel the difference. My youngest daughter, uh, she uh, she made me listen to two songs. I think one by Bruno Mars and one by uh, Ariana Grande, and both been made by AI, and I could definitely tell that they weren't, even though they sounded pretty okay. It wasn't the human. Uh, so maybe there will, and to go back to my point about more and more will be automated, but there will always be live music and live concerts and people not getting to the right note exactly. So I do feel, which makes us human and makes us interesting, because perfection isn't interesting at all. So I think the there will be more stuff that will be made efficient and effective through AI, but there will still be a slightly even more condensed version of human creativity at the top of that. I'm pretty sure.
One thing you said was you could feel the difference when you listen to these two songs. I think for the first time yesterday, I got an email that was generated with AI, and I could genuinely feel the difference. And I didn't really know how to feel about it because I'm sure it's a time saver, it is efficient, but a outreach email that's written by AI just feels not quite right. I don't
Yeah.
know. Um, but when I was looking at your work, seeing Mammoth Meatball and the Next Rembrandt, a quote came to mind that I heard from I think some VC. So it's a bit of a bit of a stretch, but the quote is, "Do it once, you're lucky. Do it twice, you're good," which I think is quite interesting. And you seem to have masterfully walked the line between societal ethics, norms, expectations, perhaps even touching around the fringe edges of outrage. What is the secret sauce for creating awe-inspiring marketing campaigns?
Being at the forefront of a technology that people know exists but don't know necessarily how to deal with, um, and doing a larger than life expression of that. I think, and again, I don't think there's a formula per se, but I think that that's what basically connects those two projects. And what nobody is seeing, of course, is the 10 things that I did that failed miserably in the meantime, because I'm not sitting on my hands for 7 years. So I think that's the difficult thing is, and I've had it in both instances, is knowing when the stars will align, and you don't. So it's just a matter of things coming together at a certain, and I refer to it just now about the time when it comes out, that that you can't plan for, because you don't know if the technology allows for what you're thinking. So things need to be developed, and I've been chasing uh, geneticists around the world via LinkedIn for years, just because they said, well, it can't be done. And we started out with dodo nuggets, just because we felt there was more genetic information about dodos, and then you speak to people. And so my point being is, the great thing about these projects is that they are just the start of something, and you don't know if there's going to be a finish line and when that finish line is going to be in sight. So you just start, and they're there. They're also very much parallel to the day to day. So you do your work, and then there's this project on the side that just simmers, and you kind of don't know if it's going to make it or not. But that's, I think, also the attraction is, as a creative that works for clients, you need to reinvent yourself uh, a few times just to know um, where the world is going culturally, where you have to take your clients to, and again, I'm not saying that that Unilever and Nestle and brands that I work for, that we can instantly implement learnings from the Mammoth Meatball into their brands, but at least I know what's possible now. I was definitely not a very experienced Rembrandt connoisseur or AI expert, and I'm still not. But I know a bit about both of them. I didn't know much about cultured meat or genetic rescue. I know a bit more. I think the naivety also allows me to break through things, because if you know too much about a subject, you're probably also inundated with the impossibilities. I don't have that. I'm just gonna like, no, we're gonna do it. Yeah, but it can't be done. No, but I'm gonna do it anyway. We'll find a way, and that just makes for a very surprising journey where you need to pivot, where you need to think on your feet. I think that's what makes this interesting as projects. So as much as I don't think there's a formula. It's just starting and then hoping that you get to the finish.
You mentioned that you were considering dodo nuggets, dodo nuggets, which made me think: Are you or have you been in touch with the company Colossal? They're a biotech firm. They're working on de-extincting the woolly mammoth.
No. I've been talking to Revive and Restore, which is out of California, connected to Harvard, and they are also in genetic restoration. And again, this project wasn't meant to revive the woolly mammoth. This is not Jurassic Park or Jurassic Pork, as some people said. This is to show the possibilities of cultured meat as a true alternative to, and a more sustainable alternative than the regular meat industry. So this is not, we're not trying to, and other people are trying to revive the woolly mammoth.
Right. I was just curious because I believe that they've recently announced as well that they're going to attempt to de-extinct the dodo bird. So that was just an interesting kind of parallel. Man, in a few years, we might be living in a world where you can order mammoth meatballs and go and see mammoths in the Pleistocene Park up in Siberia. It's alarming how fast things are moving. And you stay very close. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah. No. It's just that it's interesting because during an earlier question, I was thinking the problem is that anything is possible, and that's also, I think, what's overwhelming on whole the generative AI. I heard somebody say yesterday, it's like in a few years' time, and he said 2 years' time, you can come home from work, feel a bit stressed out, say to your computer, make a rom-com of two people. I'm the starring role, so I'm in the lead. I want that girlfriend to be my girlfriend in the movie, and then within 2 minutes you have a movie which has you starring the lead role, and everything is makeable. And the problem with that is we're not good as humans with an overload of choice. So the fact that anything is possible will only freak us out. So I think that will also help slow down these things. As I said, and nature is no longer the limitation. Our imagination is, well, where do we go now? What do we choose? I mean, so it sometimes really helps not having the choice. And I think at some point we will come back to that situation where we go like, well, not because everything is possible, we actually have to do it.
Few interesting things there. So I guess the first being, we live in a time where there are almost no constraints on what you can do. Tech tools, creative tools are so cheap. You can go online, you can pretty much make a movie with your phone. Whereas a few decades ago, it was almost the opposite. It was, no, you can't be this and that. That's just not possible. Whereas before there were a lot of constraints, it's almost like now we have no constraints. And I don't know how to strike the balance between the two. It's almost like you need to impose your own constraints in order for you to understand what you want and how to proceed in the world. which is another interesting question to ask yourself, is just what do you want? Because anything is possible, as you mentioned. Um, so you stay very close to the science, which I think is quite interesting as being an executive for an advertising firm, just to be on the bleeding edge. As you mentioned, you're working with geneticists, data scientists, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you find the most inspiration when you're engrossed in the world of science? Do you have any go-to resources or strategies or anything that you go back to the well again and again for inspiration?
No, I mean, the good thing is that everything is available everywhere now. So it doesn't take a lot to soak up new information or to hear about new things. Microsoft, which is a client of ours, is has been working on DNA data storage. So storing information into DNA, because if you think about all the football fields full of servers that we're building to be able to store all the data that we're collecting and the impact on the climate, then isn't there a better way? And apparently, DNA is a great place to store information in. So could we break down all that data and store it in genetic DNA? In synthetic DNA, and and they've been working on this for a long time, and I'm just going, okay, for somebody on the street is going like, "Whoa, what?" But if you make that emotional, and if you create a simple idea with that to make people understand about the amounts of information that we're collecting, I think we're collecting more information per second than a Formula One car going around a racetrack, which is quite a bit of information. 14 gigabyte, I think. Every one of us is collecting 14 gigabytes of information. I think it's every minute. I mean, it's most of it is useless information, but it's going to be stored anyway. We need to think about and that goes back to the regular meat industry. It's not a sustainable way of producing food. Similar here is the way that we store data now is not sustainable. So I've been looking into that for the last 5 years now, DNA data storage, and I'm going to come up with an expression that people go like, oh, okay, that makes them think, makes them talk, and then DNA data storage can become a bigger thing, because I think at the moment that stays in the heads and minds of scientists, and I think what I've learned is, while we're not good at this absolute thinking of theirs, they're not good at telling the story. So that's why I like working together with them, and that's why I like, but making something really complex, interesting and engaging and understandable is, I think, well, one of the ways that you can help a brand stand out. And I think that's, in the end, why I do this is I work for brands and I use technology to create difference for those brands. And there's just so much to be had there that and the world is going so fast that it's a great pool of inspiration.
Yeah, again, it seems like it's quite a symbiotic relationship. You, as this advertiser who's on this bleeding edge of technology, advertising, marketing, consulting, you need them to keep pushing the envelope forward, so you have new tools to kind of work with and play with. And at the same time, they need the exposure and the marketing efforts in order to continue to push forward, to get funding, to show something to their stakeholders and say, hey, look, like, this is important. People are getting it. We need to keep moving forward and keep pressing on. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think, and again, it's two blood types, so sometimes they don't really mix. But if it works, then we're able to help scientists getting these brilliant innovations out in the world in a way that people can engage with and understand. And I think that's what they're not good at, because they're just focusing on on quite complex things, which is I completely understand it. Sometimes it just takes an outsider that looks into things and tries to go like, okay, but how would a normal person, which of course is not the right terminology, but how would somebody that doesn't have the knowledge, how would they engage with this information, and how can it become important to them as well, rather than just in the scientist's head? So I really like doing that. I'm going to keep doing that.
How did you start these kind of relationships? Did you do this just through conversations? Did someone say, "Hey, I heard about this really cool thing happening over here," or do you read these in magazines or journals and then follow up?
It's reading, and seeing things, and running into things, talking to people. But um, it's mainly checking the mat. I mean, anyone is it's widely available information. It's just that nobody is thinking about acting on it because it still feels very far away. But I think that's also my job, is to make it feel not so far away.
Mm. So you've gone from something that was maybe one of the least creative jobs in the world. You studied as a logistics engineer, and now you're one of the most creative people in the world. It's your job to create, to think of these ideas, to put two and two together. Maybe not even two and two, because it's not quite obvious all the time. I mean, who thinks of a Mammoth meatball? Um, what are some of the skills that you acquired from that engineering background that have helped you the most in your day to day now, or your world now?
No, literally nothing. Nothing. That was just, well, it was a waste of time. 4 years, and again, it also wasn't, because I met my wife while I was on internship. And it's with so many people. It's I had no idea. I had no idea, and I knew I liked writing, but my dad, who was an English professor, said you shouldn't go because there's no money to be made. I think logistics is the trade of the future, which he wasn't wrong about, but it wasn't necessarily something that I felt passion for. But when I start something, I finish it. So similar to this logistic engineering studies, I finished it, and then I went and did an MBA in business, and that's where I got into contact with marketing as a field of interest. And I started reading about advertising agencies. I didn't even know that Coca-Cola wasn't making its own advertising, but that they hired an advertising agency. So that was how ignorant I was. But once I found out, I also instantly knew that this was what I was here to do. I had this sort of like an aha moment, where this whole idea of ideas that don't just float in the air, but that are restricted by a brief and a context, is something that I really like, and that hasn't changed.
So still operating within those constraints. So it's not just freewheeling, do whatever you want, but having some
No,
objectives.
no, no. And again, I'm not. That's why I'm not an artist, because I find it very hard to make an expression about myself, but to make an expression for somebody else, I like that.
I'm curious though. So with the background in engineering, did you develop that ruthlessness to get things done, that persistence, that execution part of the equation? Because a lot of creatives, I feel like they have this stream of ideas that just hits them, and they want to chase every kind of idea. But you really need to strike a balance of, okay, what am I going to pursue, and how am I going to actually get this thing done and out the door? Is there anything like that you picked up during that time, or have you always been a very go getter?
No, no. I've always been very competitive, and in the beginning of my career, I had no idea what a good idea was, because that's something that critical thinking is something that you develop over time. So I could not have done these ideas earlier in my career. So you need to get to this phase where you actually know you have something good, and then once you have that, then there is something taking over. So it's not me necessarily. It basically is the idea that needs to manifest itself, and I'm not a bystander or a passenger, but I'm just there to make that happen. It, I feel that the idea needs to see the light of day, and then nothing's going to stop me. And I think it's easy for me to say that because I'm in a position where I can also make that happen. And I think, especially early in your career, that's not always the case. Um, but that's what I feel with people that are truly creative, is that once an idea hits them, it doesn't let them go, and they need to do everything, even if it takes them 10 years to make that idea come alive. And then it still doesn't necessarily mean it's successful, but that's I think the beauty of this industry is, at least for me, is we're just there to make sure that the ideas that hit us are brought to life. And an idea on paper is nothing. It needs to see the light of day. So, and then it helps to be a bit relentless. Yes.
When did you know that advertising and marketing was the path for you? Was there a project that you completed or an idea that you had that you executed on that you really sat back with yourself and just went, ah, yeah, there it is?
No, it was just the pure joy. And uh, in the beginning of my career, I had the middle name 17, Bas 17 Korsten. And it was because I always came up with 17 ideas. I just forced myself to come up with 17 ideas just to make sure that I didn't fall for the first and most obvious solution. So at a certain point, I didn't need to get to 17 to understand what was a good idea. But in the beginning, that helped me in making sure that I kept pushing myself, not to be too happy with myself. Because as a creative, you sometimes go like, "Oh, that's a great idea," and you go like, "Well, really?" So I think getting to 17 helped me do that.
That's fascinating to me because it sounds like you're working actively on your creativity. It's not something that just kind of you were born and you naturally have all these great ideas. It's something that, okay, maybe you might be inclined to have ideas or these creative thoughts, but then actually working through them, reflecting on them, picking them apart, trying to figure out where they work, where they don't work. That effort of building that muscle, building that skill. I wanted to ask you about how you foster your own innovation. So I've heard you speak about going out into nature, having wide horizons, a lot of space, trying to be able to let your ideas kind of float in, come to you, connect things together. So once you've done that, go for a walk in the woods, etc. How do you actually take that state of mind and come up with ideas? Do you have a pen and paper with you? Are you coming back to your office and trying to jot things down? What does that look like for you?
You picked up on something which is very true. Is I do find it very fascinating to think about creativity and how to um, elicit it and how to build it. And I think the insights that we're getting from neuroscience, we're just not using them as creative people in order to get to better ideas. I come up with most ideas in bed when the light's gone out. So basically, when the light goes out, then my head starts working and starts making the connections between all the different points of information and creating relevant and less relevant new notions out of them. Um, and I make I don't know what the right terminology is in English, but I make these letter combinations. So when I wake up, I know that it's PPRTBV.
Oh, like an acronym, like that sequence stands for something that you recall?
But it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But they all stand for something that I thought of, and I'll be able then to work back what it was. So just because I don't want to turn on the light or do a like a tape recorder next to my bed. So I just, that's the way that I work and keep the idea. And again, 95% of them are useless the next morning, but sometimes one of them makes sense.
So we talked a lot about sourcing inspiration from science, trying to connect these ideas together. How do you strike a balance between your consumption of content and then your actual production or your downtime where it's more output focused, where you're actually writing pen and paper, trying to connect ideas, thinking, being with your thoughts? There's enough content on the internet for thousands of lifetimes to consume, right? So I, based on the difference in bandwidth, how do you balance that?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So how do you essentially balance your inputs from your outputs? So how do you balance how much you're consuming and taking in versus how much you're trying to produce new things?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first, which is the intake, is not a conscious effort. I just live. I just go out. I go to the movies. I listen to music. I read. I'm not doing that consciously thinking. I need things in my head to make those connections. So I just look at the world and look at people and look at paintings in museums and words in books, and that all gets stored, and then I need that time, the lights out, to make those connections. So it's not a conscious thing that I do. What I do consciously is that, is it ruminating? No, it's allowing these ideas to just walk freely and get your brain into an alpha state. I do that consciously. So I do look at the window, and stare, just making sure that my mind is unfocused. Because for the ideas to come, your mind needs to be unfocused. And technology and is all keeping us super focused all day. So sometimes you need to create the possibility for your mind to unfocus. And that is something that I do consciously indeed. But then I'm not expecting anything to happen then. I'm just allowing my brain to make the connections. And then at some point, something comes. So
See, I'm a little bit worried about that. So there's a researcher, Dr. Gloria Mark. I don't know where she studies, and I wish that I had that in front of me. But she's basically looked at attention spans over the course of time. So in the early 2000s, I believe, she found that the average person took 2.5 minutes to change the computer screen that they're looking at. So you're on one tab, 2.5 minutes, you switch over to something else. I think in the 2010s, that dropped to 47 seconds. And then even more recently, I believe it almost halved again, maybe something like 28 in that ballpark. So people, I feel like, are not taking the time because they're in this hypnosis or this trance. So could you talk a little bit more about the alpha state? Is that a term that you've coined, or is that an actual neuroscience?
that is the actual neuroscience term. And it is basically, if you look at leaves on a tree, and I'm looking at them now, and you just focus on that, then you get into this, you get your brain into this state where it's just not thinking. And to your point, I mean, this phone thing, this laptop, everything keeps us constantly on our toes and focused. They did a test between people, and they sent two people into the woods for 4 days, and they had two people that are, and then they sent the same people into like an urban environment, and they did simple creative tests. And a simple creative test, for instance, is find uncommon uses for common objects. So if I say a spoon, what kind of uses can you think of? And then you go like, well, eating, egg race, uh, burying people. I mean, just thinking about uncommon uses of that common object. People that went into the woods for 4 days were, I think, 40% more creative than people that were in that urban environment. So it just goes to show you that making those connections in your head is easier when you're surrounded by things that put your mind into the alpha state. It can be the sea, it can be nature, but everything else keeps us on our toes. And I think we're not by any means in our industry using those insights enough to get to better ideas and to get to more interesting ideas.
So I could imagine somebody would be listening to this and they might be thinking to themselves, oh, I wish I was creative. That sounds like so much fun. Or they might tell themselves, oh, I'm just not a creative person. To that person who believes that story or tells that story to themselves, what would you say to them?
Creativity is about connecting existing notions in your head. Some people are built for that better than others, but everyone can be creative. But there are low creative people and high creative people. And it has all to do with neuroplasticity. So how flexible is your brain and how quickly can you make those connections in your head? It's trainable. So it's just that nobody's doing it necessarily, but it's trainable. So you can become more creative. You can put yourself in situations where you can be more creative. But I think that, as we said before, is only half the battle, because then it comes down to, okay, how relentless are you in pursuing that idea? And if it doesn't grab you and doesn't let go of you, then it's probably not meant to be. So I think everyone has those ideas sometime. I mean, I'm assuming where you go, I need to do this. I just need to do this. And then it's a matter of context and if you're in the end able to get it over the finish line. But I think that's what's interesting, is everyone can be creative. Anyone can be more creative than they were yesterday. If you think about taking the same route to work, that's basically killing your creativity. Take a different route. Try to use your wrong hand for a day. Just walk with one eye shut. Just do things. Force yourself to not get into the routine, because the routine will kill your creativity. And sit differently at the table, at a different place. People tend to go like, oh, I just want to sit at the same place of that table every time, because routine helps us save energy in our brain, and creativity is taking energy, and your brain is going like, well, let's just do the same thing because that's easier. But hey, easier is not necessarily better.
Bas Korsten, ladies and gentlemen. Bas, if anyone would like to follow you and your work, where can they go?
Oh, good question. I'm not. Yeah, LinkedIn.
This was supposed to be the easy question.
Just go on LinkedIn. Just go on LinkedIn and connect with me.
And your agency is Wunderman Thompson.
Wunderman Thompson, and we're in every city, major city, every major country in the world. So there's always a Wunderman Thompson near you.
Bas, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jack.